Well, hey everyone, welcome. It is time for another episode of Certified Forgotten. And it is, in case there was any doubt, it is a Certified Forgotten week. Donato and I actually had a little conversation about this. What is a Certified Forgotten week? What is an uncertified week? It's a bit arbitrary. It's based mostly on vibes and love. But what that means for you right now is that we have an excellent guest this week. We're going to talk about a movie that they picked. So you're going to get the full 60-minute experience of the podcast. I am, as always, Matt Monagle. I am one half of your Matt hosts. I am joined by my friend, my partner in crime, my soggy little boy today in a rainy Los Angeles. It's Matt Donato. How you doing, buddy?
I don't know how I feel about you calling me your soggy little boy.
It's
That's
true.
that's exactly how I am doing. But yes, no, it is quite rainy today, but it will not be rainy vibes on the podcast. Which, yeah, just to echo Monagle, I in my sense of the podcast, it is always the guest episodes are my favorite. That is what we
Mm-hmm.
started the podcast on. We did it twice a month. It was hard to get guests and keep them going that long, but now we're not having that issue anymore. So I don't know. Maybe I'll take a little credit here, and I kind of went to Monagle and I'm like, hey, if we have 4 guests in a month, I think I'm fine with that. Because if we can keep churning out guest episodes, like that's where I think our bread and butter is. We're just two dudes talking about movies otherwise. And yeah, we are smart
Yeah.
dudes talking about movies, but the internet doesn't need more of that. I kind of think.
Hold on. I have an idea. What if two cis white guys, now hold on, were to start a podcast where we talked about horror movies? Donato, do you think there's a market there for that?
Two cis white guys named Matt, nonetheless.
Yep.
Like, we couldn't even find different names. We just kind of became the stereotype. But yeah, anyway, so just getting that out in the open, where if you love our I guess our review episodes, tell us. Maybe we'll do more of those in between. But if we have the chance, we're always going to come with 4 guests in a month. Screw it. Why the hell not?
Yeah. And especially part of the fun of that is that we get to talk to people that we have admired online, that we followed online, that we're familiar with their writing. And sometimes it's an opportunity for us to get them on the mic and get to know them a little bit better. So I feel like that's a perfect segue for you to introduce today's guest, Matthew.
Wow, it's almost like you knew how I was going to do the intro. God damn it. So, Monagle did exactly what I was going to say. It's always nice when you can follow someone for a long time, meet them in person, finally put faces to names, and be like, yo, come on my damn podcast. So, that's exactly what's happening this episode. Please welcome horror journalist for Fangoria, Off Screen, Moviejawn, other places too, probably. You've probably seen this name before. Vannah Taylor. Vannah, welcome.
Hello, hello. It's been a long time coming. I'm finally here.
I know I did do the reach out like a while ago, and it happens. You do the reach out, things fall behind. But then I saw you in person. I'm like, no, you can't get out of this time.
Yeah. Yeah, the DMs become a scary place. So, you know, it's nice to actually see people in person, especially since we're both like actually on this coast, on the same coast, whereas like everyone else I talk to is like in different places in the world, across in the UK and things like that. So it's like I'm finally seeing someone who actually lives in the same state as me.
Time zones finally align. No one has to be up at 2 in the morning or something.
Mm. Yeah, it is. It's always something that I find funny is there's such vibrant horror communities on the East Coast and on the West Coast, but it is the hardest thing. That's like a 3-hour time difference. It's the hardest thing. Like even Donato and I, Central and Pacific, it can be difficult to wrangle stuff when you've got screenings in the evening and you're trying to move stuff in that narrow window. If you have like a life or friends or family you want to see too. So I appreciate you, Vanna, taking the time to triangulate across 2 different time zones and come join us today.
No, yeah, it was perfect. Usually I'm having to accommodate like on my podcast when we do very rarely have guests, try to accommodate very, very different time zones.
Donato, how many years did you run a podcast from Los Angeles with a guy that lived in Scotland? That was a monumentous achievement.
We had 4 of us, and it was Scotland, Portland. Where was Rob at that time? I forget where Rob Hunter was. And then I was in New York City. So we literally were on West Coast, East Coast, fucking Scotland with Kieran. Like we did it all somehow. I don't know. Kieran was the one that gets all the credit because it'd be like 3 in the morning. And he's like, all right, let's go podcast time. And we're like, are you sure, dude? Are you good? And I don't know how he did it. He was always great.
Yeah, with my podcast, like all of us are in the same time zone and it is still impossible to get us to get us scheduled. podcasting is hard. So
Yeah, I feel like the two things that I hear the most about are like if you have kids or you have a podcast, schedules are just really, really hard to line up. So thankfully, I have a podcast, not kids. I'm very, very happy with that decision. But we digress a little bit, Vanna. I wanted to start this episode by talking to you a bit about your earliest horror memories. That's always something we like to lead off with our guests. You know, I feel like everybody has some kind of formative, slightly too early experience when it comes to their relationship with the horror genre. So, are there any books? Are there any movies? Is there anything that stands out as something you consumed maybe a little too young and sort of set the stage for the career that would be?
yeah, I've had a long lifetime of consuming content that was not age appropriate. I mean, I've always been someone who is into the weird things, I guess. Like every show, every movie, every thing I was into when I was really little, right off the bat, was something spooky. I do have a core memory of being around like 4 or 5, and my dad was watching TV really late and it woke me up. So I went out to see what he was watching, and he invited me to come sit down with him, and it was The Thing.
Hmm.
So that was my earliest horror memory. But then, of course, like I said, spent my youth reading Stephen King books before I could really comprehend anything he was talking about. You know, one of my favorite TV shows when I was in elementary school was like Ghost Adventures and stuff like that. Like I just was always into creepy stuff, and that eventually turned into going to Hollywood Video and, renting movies. And yeah, so it's been a lifelong thing for me.
And that's something that we bring a lot of people on the podcast that talk about their relationship to film or even television. But what I've gleaned from social media is you add an element that I really love, which is you are a voracious horror reader too. You read a lot of horror fiction too. So I want to know a little bit. You know, we've talked in bits and pieces on the podcast in the history about there seeming to be a bit of parental double standards when it's like you can't go see that R-rated movie, but yeah, I'll check out Stephen King from the library because hey, at least you're reading. Was that part of your experience growing up too? Did you get away with stuff in book form that you maybe couldn't have otherwise?
I would say I was on a pretty loose leash. My mom actually, she's a big Stephen King fan, so she had a whole shelf of Stephen King books, and so I would kind of just pick one out every now and then. Like one I remember, I was like in elementary school reading Misery, and
Woof.
I was very, conscious of the fact that this was beyond my age group. Like, I was trying to read Bram Stoker's Dracula that young. I was always able to kinda just get my hands on whatever. Yeah, I don't know, my parents were pretty lenient. I think I was a very, to myself kind of child, so
Mm.
no one had to tell me to do my homework, no one had to tell me to do anything, and yeah, kinda like you said, it was like, "Oh, well, she's off reading, so
How
she's
much trouble
fine."
could she be in, right? Yeah. What could she
Yeah,
possibly be doing that would traumatize her later in life?
yeah, but like I said, my dad would also let me watch things like The Thing. He also did that with Scream, and I would always hear, my mom in the background like, "They shouldn't be watching that," and he's like, "It's fine." So now I like to remind him of that when I show him things like Martyrs or Eden Lake, and he's like, "What is wrong with you?" And I'm like, "You did it."
So, like, that's cool it works in reverse, though, because it's always well, I shouldn't say always, but most of the time we talk to guests, it's very much how they were introduced to horror and how they, like, came about it and what they were shown. So that, like, that's awesome that you come home and be like, "Oh, you gotta watch this, like, new French extremity horror movie," or, like, something like that. Like, that is an awesome relationship to have because I could never do that with my parents. Like, neither of my parents are horror fans. They think I am just the odd duckling here, like, "What the fuck is wrong with you?" kinda shit. I still remember my mom walked down while I was watching Dead Sushi, and she just looked at me. She's like, "What? What?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I don't know. It's my side job. What do you want from me?"
Yeah, my parents act like that a lot. They're like, "Why are you so into this?" Or, some of the things I watch are a bit more extreme than the things they would watch, but at the same time, whenever I do talk about things, then they will offer up little nuggets that are like, "Oh, you're also secretly like kind of a big horror fan." Like my mom loves Hellraiser. Like loves Hellraiser. Like she heard about it coming back into theaters, like it's showing like at some theaters and she was like she texted me, "Hellraiser is in theaters on this day and this day." And I'm like, "Okay, are you telling me that you want me to take you to go see Hellraiser?" um yeah, there's just lots of weird little things that they bring up about their own movie going experiences. Or I remember some VHSs and even later on like DVDs on the shelf that I'm like, if you think I'm so weird for like liking Saw, why was there a Saw DVD on the shelf?
Right.
Like, where there's a disconnect here. But yeah, it's really fun. We get to have a lot of family movie nights where um, they ask for my suggestion, and then it ends up being probably a little too intense for everybody. But we actually have a lot of fun doing that.
Yeah, it's one of those things. So when you tell somebody you're a horror fan, that might mean something to you, but there's a range of things that can mean to someone else, right? So like I there's an old Pete Holmes the comedian line about how he looks like he has the face of like a youth minister. And I feel like I bring a little bit of youth minister energy to the table, unfortunately. So when I tell people I'm really into horror, sometimes I have conversations and they're like, "Oh yeah, me too. I really like insert classic here," which is great. I'm so happy to have that conversation. I was trying to remember the most recent, but recently I was talking to somebody and they were like, "Oh, you're really into horror. That's cool. Have you ever seen The Sadness?" And I was like, "Oh my god. Like that is like I thought we were going to talk down here and you went to a movie that I refuse to watch because I know it's too much for me." So, finding those boundaries with people is always part of the fun for me because horror could mean Hellraiser, it could mean Tremors, it could mean anything and everything in between.
Yep, and that's exactly why I love it. Yeah, I do have a full sleeve of tattoos all related to horror movies so that despite my introverted nature leads to a lot of random like, "Oh, hey, those are cool. Oh, I know that movie," or
Yeah.
random conversations pop up and I always get the things like, "Oh yeah, I like stuff like this, but I couldn't do like, anything like Saw or something." And I'm like, that's my bread and butter right there. Like I have a Billy tattoo of all things, but yeah, it's always fun to kind of see like when people notice you and then
Mhm.
what kind of comes out of their mouth? Like what is the first thing that kind of triggers their brain when they think of horror? That's what I love about it.
I do like that I have a bunch of horror tattoos, but they're disguised as food tattoos. So when people first see them, they're like, "Oh, it's a pizza slice and a hamburger and all these things." And I'm like, "Yeah, totally." And then they look closer, like, "Oh shit, that's ghost faced. Oh shit, that's this, that's that." So I get the same sometimes of I mean mine are more hidden. I'll say like mine are because of my day job. I kind of got them strategically where if I have to go to a client meeting, they'll never know. So that always happens in public. But then like when somebody does see them immediately, it is the conversation of like, "Oh, like those are horror tattoos, are they?" And yeah, it just immediately starts that flow of conversation.
Yeah, one of my favorites is one of my most visible ones is on my forearm, and I get the is that Megan Fox tattoo? Isn't that the girl from Transformers? And I'm like, this is Jennifer Check. Like, learn your history.
I want to talk a little bit too about how, because now, Donato did the introduction, you've written for a lot of different places, and you've been able to bring some of your passions onto the page with some really great writing. Did you always know that you wanted to write about horror? Was that something that, like, in high school you were kind of tinkering with, in college you were kind of tinkering with, or is it something that you found a little bit later in life for you?
It is fairly new. I've only really been writing about horror within the last couple years. I did always want to be a writer growing up. Like I mentioned, I started reading Stephen King very young. So I always had this like back of my mind romanticized idea that, one day I would write a novel or something. But
Mm.
as you grow older and you have to think about your place in the labor force. Some passions get kind of thrown aside, and I was totally on a different path, and then I was in the middle of my master's thesis, and I completely pivoted and decided I wanted to make my thesis about horror movies. Luckily, my major was in sociology, so I was able to spin it. It's not like I was, in some sort of like STEM field,
Yep.
where that would totally not make sense. Yeah, so I was able to really spin it, and then that's kind of around the time when I started on the side writing for different outlets, to kind of get those creative juices flowing and write about some things that were outside of the topic of my thesis because that gets tiring. But yeah, and I really found my love of writing about these films in that kind of sociological approach. So a lot of my writing does come off as academic. I try to make it still accessible, but yeah, I'm always kind of really connecting to what's going on in society because we all know that that is where a lot of horror stems from, the horrors of the world. So I love being able to connect those things. And I've been a chronic overthinker my entire life. And so I've
Mm.
always had these thoughts about these films. But it was not something I ever thought would be something I would actually be doing, let alone getting paid for it or anything like that. But yeah, I've kind of found that when I was in college, so just a couple years ago. Yeah, and I chose like the most like disturbing content to write about. My thesis was all about rape revenge, and so I spent a lot of time watching those kinds of films and so yeah, I went really hard, really deep, really quick.
Yeah, that's the BJ Colangelo and Anya Stanley track there. That is
Mhm.
that is
Mhm.
definitely read a few articles about those for sure. And I mean, I think it's hard too because I mean, like Monocle, you have an academic paper too. Like you wrote about Maniac, right?
Yes, I wrote about. I mean, it's a silly story, but when I applied back to grad school, I didn't have any academic writing that was any like within the last 5 years on my resume. So I actually wrote an academic paper just to have something to show when I applied to school and got in. So academic writing is fun, man. It's you just get to like dig into a bunch of different articles and different books and like play with all of the best ideas that you find from other writers. I've said it on the show before, I will say it again. Film critics tend to think that we have invented the wheel, but whatever your niche is, the thing that you're most passionate about, that you think that like you are the expert on this thing as a popular film critic, I guarantee you there's some senior thesis or master's thesis languishing on academia.edu where somebody did like 10 times the amount of research. So it's always good to look at academia and kind of dig a little bit into what people are interested in.
Yeah, it was actually really interesting because while I was in the middle of doing my thesis, my second chapter was focused on the remakes of a few big rape revenge films because I covered
Hmm.
Last House on the Left and I Spit on Your Grave. And so because the basis of my thesis was kind of connecting a post 9/11 society and like the sentiments, the public feelings to a post Vietnam society. And so like kind of tracing how rape revenge films became much more popular during that period, and why that is and how that mirrored what was happening in the 70s. And so I was kind of doing a lot of this work, and thinking about and watching a lot of 2000s and talking about torture porn and things like that. And then I connected with Ariel and she was like, I'm like writing a book about that right now. And so it was kind of fun. We got to like behind the scenes in our own DMs, like kind of like gush about a lot of these movies together. So it was fun. I was like, someone else is like on the same wavelength as me. That's always fun.
Yeah, there was a little resurgence there at that time because you're right, like all those remakes and not even like remakes and sequels. Like I Spit in Your Grave, the remake happened, and then like two sequels happened on that. They just kept trying in all those movies. There's this movie called Felt that's really good. I dig that one as like a new age kind of rape revenge. But yeah, that definitely is like a really interesting parallel to take. And like that's again, that's why I think the academic writing, as much as my writing doesn't always turn out academic, like, you know, I'm writing about the pew pew and the pew, like all that shit. Like I have fun with my writing, but
Those are, by the way, the pew pew and the blah are very, very specific
yeah,
academic terms. So yeah, I just want to throw that out
absolutely.
there.
Yeah. Yeah, they're in there. But no, I mean like the academic, like when you can take those things and like contextualize it to political, social elements that are happening, because it's like you said before, horror is always, it's always reflecting society in some way. Even if somebody doesn't want to make it mean something, it does, because your horror movie still has a point and it's still taking a side and it's still saying something at the end of the day. And you know, people can read into that, but you can't avoid it either. Like that's the thing. And to dig into it and really like outline those kind of things. But I will say, Monocle, I highly doubt there's an academic paper that goes as hard into Dude Bro Party Massacre 3 than I ever have. So I'm gonna challenge that statement.
Okay. All right. I am going to, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go find that academic paper and I'm going to share it with you because I guarantee you there is one. But bringing the focus back to, as much as I would love to talk to you about Deep Bro Party Massacre 3, Donato, bringing the focus back to you for a second, Vanna. You know, one of the things that I think, one of the misnomers, one of the misunderstandings you have about film criticism is because there are so many people that are like, it is an all-consuming passion. They have a breadth of understanding and a singularity of focus that people that are breaking into the industry can find a little intimidating. But I've always been a believer in, you know, being a jack of all trades, master of none. I think that all of the different experiences you can have in life, even if you're not, you know, an expert on 100 years worth of film cinema, that oftentimes will bring you to a place where you have insights that somebody that maybe just looks at film for a living doesn't have. So you talked a little bit about approaching films through a sociological lens, and I want to ask a little bit for those that are like, I love film, but I'm doing a, you know, I'm in college or I'm in grad school, I'm doing a different thing, so like that ship has sailed. What has your multidisciplinary approach brought to you as a film critic? How does that help you appreciate and write about films maybe a little bit differently or a little bit better than some writers might have?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the things that it has helped me with is like finding a value in my voice. Like there are, like you said, there's so many people that have like their expertise, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, I'm pretty new, I guess, to the game. So I had a lot of that, like, why is anyone gonna read what I'm writing? You know, like
Yeah.
why should anyone care? And also, even if there's something that someone else might have, you know, kind of touched on, like how can I expand on it? How can I put my spin on something? And so just kind of like sticking to that passion I have has helped me like remind myself that like someone is going to want to read this. I think also what I often get to do is I get to like breathe new life into films that are maybe trashed on. Like, I kind of what I brought up with, like, the early 2000s, like, that was kind of just thought of as being violence for violence sake and things like that, but being able to contextualize it, you kind of get to, you know, celebrate these films in a way,
Yeah.
or, like, something like one man's trash is another man's treasure. There are a lot of films that get, like, smack talked, and, you know, I'll watch them and I'm like, "Oh, this actually reminds me of, like, this philosopher," or something like, "This is reminding me of something that has been going on," like, or a trend that has been going on, and so, even if the movie itself isn't super amazing, being able to pick at those, I think, um you know, it it celebrates the film in a way. I don't know if that makes sense, but
No, it does.
yeah, there's just a lot of films that get, you know, trashed on for being violent, or there's like a depiction of something that people consider wrong or something, you know, but if you're able to kind of place it in society for some reason, then if I expand on that, then maybe someone will watch it again and think differently about it, you know? I like to I don't like to hate anything, and so I like to always find something. Like, a good example, I think this was just on a podcast, I didn't write about it, but I Spit on Your Grave, Vengeance is Mine, I think. That's, like, the 3rd one? The 3rd one in the remake kind of franchise. I got to talk about that with Ariel and with Tori Potenza, and, we were just, like, really going in on this film that is really not that amazing. And it has its own issues, but we were really going in on a lot of the kind of conversation it was having. And at the end of our conversation, we all were like, I was ready to come on here and trash talk this film, but now we all have like this deeper appreciation. And it's almost like sometimes I like give films credit that maybe they don't totally deserve just because I am able to like reach for something. But I think that's great to do because I think, film is art, and maybe there was something this writer was thinking about that they didn't know they were thinking about, and I noticed it and no one else noticed. But yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, especially for movies like that at that time. I mean, I just checked the Rotten Tomatoes and it sure as shit fits our criteria. Only 4 reviews, but that's what we always talk about. That time period of horror, and even I Spin Your Grave 3, the one you're referencing, it came out in 2015, so that's still only about a decade ago at this point. But that whole 2000s and early 2010s era of horror was so hard to have like real conversations about with people because critics didn't want to. They didn't want to have a full conversation, or so I should say, the critics that were most prominent at that time. Like they were not paying attention to movies like this, the VODs or the DVDs that we're going straight to. Um, when you get to go back and recontextualize that period in horror, and I do it so much with the remakes on my remake column, it's the same. It's like the same conversation. That's why I love it too. Like you go back and this movie that was just maligned at the time, like my favorite example is Friday the 13th. The remake has like a fucking 20% on Rotten Tomatoes, or like not even. It could be like an 18, I forget, but it's in that area. And you go back watch it, you're like, this movie isn't like a 20%. It just doesn't reflect that. I've seen 20%
Mhm.
movies before and I know them. So I think it's freeing when you go back and recontextualize things and look at them at the time and be like, why did we receive it like this? What made the critics receive it like this? And like I think that's special too, like to speak to the fact that we're all freelance critics too. And I'll air quotes it because we all have day jobs. That's what this is. Like we all have our paying gigs. And when we write about things, it's because we fucking love it. Like it's we're not on staff anywhere, so we don't have to churn things out. When we take an assignment, we take what we want to write about. And I think there is something freeing to that. And that is a conversation between film criticism itself and what people look at as a hobbyist and what people look at as a legitimate critic. Like I could go on that for another half an hour, but I do think there's something freeing to the fact that we're all pitching what we want to pitch. We all write what we want to write, and that influences our writing. Like that's where we come from at the end of the day. It's a place of we have to fucking love this shit to do it. Like we don't have time to do this, but we have to fucking love it to find the time to do it.
Yeah, and I think the same can also be said about like making films. Like making a film is really hard, and I think, and it's also art, and just like with any art form, you have to ask, like, what made this artist create this? And so, sometimes even if it's like some really dumb remake of a film that came out 30 years ago, I think it's interesting to ask, well, why did someone want to remake that? And it was really hard to make regardless of how it's being perceived. And so if you can, give someone, some stars for making something that was really hard to make, I think that's, like you said, I love film, so I don't want to like discourage people from making more. You know, and yeah, I just love it. Of course, there's something that I take on that, I don't always love, but then I like to challenge myself to find the thing in it that is
Mhm.
redeemable. And So I think that is always like a really fun challenge to give myself too when I'm writing.
Yeah, like, I mean, as a critic, if I see a movie I don't like, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. Like, my review will always be truthful, but still, at the end of the day, if
Yeah.
I write a negative review, the point of that review is for that movie to still find its audience. It's not just to be like, I don't know, I think we're out of the "Ain't It Cool" news era of just shitting on movies for the sake of shitting on them. Like, to me, criticism is more valuable when I don't like a movie, but I can still drive it to the right audience, you know? Like, that to me is good criticism. I don't know.
Yes. Agreed.
And I'm really glad we had this conversation. And Vanna, I'm particularly glad you talked about going on a podcast and convincing other people to give a movie a second chance, because the film we're going to talk about on today's podcast, I hated for a whole ass hour until I didn't anymore. And I think that that is a wonderful jumping off point to talk about Spoonful of Sugar. So we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about Spoonful of Sugar. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back. So, on the podcast this week, for our viewing pleasure, Van has brought us Spoonful of Sugar. And if you haven't seen it yet, it's on Shudder. You can go stream it right now. It's only 90 minutes, which is the perfect movie, so it's definitely worth the effort. But if you want to dive right in, quick plot synopsis for you. After bouncing around foster homes for much of her life, things are finally coming together for Millicent. Her therapy treatments, which now involve microdoses of LSD, are showing good signs of progress, and she even has a well paying job as a nanny to Johnny, the nonverbal child of a local author. But as Millicent entrenches herself further in the lives of her new clients, she learns that her ward might have a dark side that mirrors her own. If she can harness Johnny's potential, then Millicent and Johnny might be the only family each other would ever need. All right, Vanna, your pick. You had all the movies in the world that have 10-ish reviews to choose from. What made you want to talk about Spoonful of Sugar?
Well, I do want to say first of all, I mean, it's really hard to like pick from the list of films that fit that criteria.
Yeah.
I was like so sure. I don't know, every like sometimes I do watch a movie that I feel like no one else talks about. Like I'll go to Letterboxd and see if anyone I know has logged it, and then I'll check, check Rotten Tomatoes and stuff. And I swear there are movies I've watched that would fit the criteria, but then when I was asked, to present something, I was like, suddenly mind is blank.
Mhm.
I do want to say, not to keep bringing up Ariel, like I'm so obsessed with her, but I wanted to do Wrong Turn 2, but then she took it, which it's a great pick for her. She's probably much more, you know, well equipped to talk about that film. But yeah, I don't know. It was really hard. But when I saw that Spoonful of Sugar was on that list, I was like, I have never spoken with anyone else about this film. Like, this is something that I feel like I thought I was like the only person who has watched it. I know that's not true because I know a couple people who have seen it, but I I just no one talks about it. It's kind of sitting on Shudder. I enjoyed it, and I enjoy this director. She had something else that recently came out at this latest Fantastic Fest, so I was like, I feel like this would be fun to talk about.
Yeah, Mercedes Bryce Morgan, Bone Lake came out or hit the festival scene this past year. Am I remembering? Either of you can answer this. I haven't unfortunately seen that one. I actually don't think I've seen any of her films, but people really like Bone Lake, right? That was a buzzy film coming off the festival scene.
I think so. I loved it. That was one of my most anticipated of the festival, because I liked Spoonful of Sugar. But yeah, other than like my little handful of friends that went with me, I haven't seen much because I don't think it has a distributor, so
Hmm.
it's not publicly available. So unless you went at Fantastic Fest. Yeah, everyone, it was like a hoot and a holler. It was really fun. Like, so just that alone, I was like, okay, people like this. Can we get more eyes on it, please?
Yeah, I mean, I watched Bone Lake because y'all were talking about it. It was on my list. I just never got to it because of scheduling, but can confirm Bone Lake rips. I mean, this is I think it's a filmmaker with style and a filmmaker with a specific style that really goes hard into the psychosexual, which is not something we get super a lot of
Yeah.
today. Like we get psychosexual horror movies, do not get me wrong, those exist. But I feel like the way that this particular filmmaker kind of goes into it, I mean, Spoonful of Sugar is doing psychosexual and also Alice in Wonderland and also like a rape revenge movie at the same time. Like it's somehow all three of those, and I'm like, how the fuck are you balancing this?
Yeah, there's a lot going on. I hadn't rewatched it since my first watch, so I was like, okay, I know there was so much that I know I didn't fully digest, and so that's why I was also excited to talk about it and get a chance to rewatch it. And yeah, there's so much. I mean, it's called Spoonful of Sugar, so we have a little bit of like Mary Poppins, but then she's kind of like a Little Red Riding Hood, but she's the wolf, but then she's also, like you said, it's kind of a rape revenge, and it's a lot. But it's fun because of that.
It's definitely one of those films where, and thus me struggling with it for the first hour, I think yeah, definitely there's fairy tale elements to it. There's Lolita elements to it too, which is like anytime you compare something to Lolita, buckle the fuck up a little bit. So Vanna, in your like, what is something? How should people approach this film if they're listening to the podcast and they're like, "Cool, a movie I haven't seen, I want to sit down." Like, what is the proper context in which to approach this film? Because there's a lot of ways that you could sit down and watch Spoonful of Sugar and bounce off the movie really hard, or have the movie bounce off of you. So, if you're someone that believes it's important to adjust your expectations accordingly before you go watch anything, how would you adjust folks' expectations if they're going to go sit down and watch this movie for the first time and delve into the psychosexual?
That is such a good question. I feel like I'm still digesting my second watch.
Hmm.
I feel like especially lately, I there's a lot of discourse about morality in films. There's a lot of like they did something not good and that's bad, and
Yep.
and I feel like this is something that's really playing with the moral compass of all of its characters. Not just the babysitter, but the mom and the dad and the kids and every character, even the therapist. I feel weird about everyone in this film. And so I feel like you just have to be really open to anything. And I think also because of not just the fairy tale elements, but I think with any film, even if it is technically presented with realism, each film I think exists within its own universe. And so you have to kind of put down the why. Why is this happening? Why would they do that? Why, because when you kind of put that, you kind of put your judgments or your expectations of why someone would do something, it kind of dampens your ability to accept the kind of world that this movie is in. Not that it's like some sci-fi weird alternate universe, but it is everyone in this story, just like a fairy tale, is kind of operating within their own, like the universe's set of rules in a way, which is that there are no rules, kind of, because everyone's a little weird. But yeah, you just have to be really, really open.
Yeah, I mean, there is so much going on here, and I think that is to the film's detriment in certain points. I like the film. I'm one of the reviews on Rotten Tomatoes that is positive for it. Like, I enjoy this movie, and I think it's doing a lot right. But it is so much to digest because, like, think of all the stories that are going on. Like, you have Millicent, who is the babysitter that we focus on, and is she trying to fuck the dad? Is she trying to take the family over because she wants to give a child the attention she never got because she's a foster kid. Like right there alone, there are 3 different kind of stories being told. And then you mentioned the therapist. Like the therapist is kind of the caterpillar in this whole scenario. And we find out that he's just dosing people with LSD because he's trying some new wave hippie drug cure for anything. And then you have the mom. Like you have a mother who is keeping her child under lock and key in the house because she says he has every allergy under the sun. Like he's allergic to smoke and he's allergic to organic like everything this kid could be allergic to, she says he is. And that becomes now a question of, is this another scenario of she's just turning her kid into a homebody because she wants to keep him there? Like there's so much going on.
Munchausen by proxy.
Right, exactly that. And then you have the dad, like the whole Lolita thing. Like, okay, she wants to fuck the dad immediately, but he's playing into it. There is just so much surreality happening, and I think that is a lot, and that can be a lot for some people because this movie doesn't stay grounded. It goes hard into all of those elements that I wasn't expecting it to, and like I hadn't watched it either since it played Fantasia or Fantastic all those years ago. I forget which one, and like I forgot the ending. The ending happens. I'm like, oh right, it's like none of those. It's literally none of those things. It does its own thing in the end, and like I respected it more again for that. I think on the second watch, I was like, fuck, you really did just say screw all that shit. We have another ending for this, and I'm like, it's kind of ballsy. I like it.
Yeah, it's definitely a film. I think that, and both of you have alluded to this, which I think is a really good way of putting it. It is grounded for a while and completely, and I'm going to air quotes this, completely mistreats its like subject material, where you have like, to your point, Vanna, people that are looking for reasons to waggle their fingers at movies or to say that they're problematic. Like this is a very problematic movie until it shifts into a gear in the back third, I think, which is like, hey, this is all like everybody's horrible. Like there are no good people or bad people in this movie. There are just monsters of varying degrees. And when I say that I hated it for an hour and then ended up respecting it, it's because of that tonal shift, Anata, that you mentioned, where in the end it basically like, and the way that I described it when I was talking to people about it is it doubles and triples down on itself rather than shying away from the material that it presents. It leans heavily and hard into its own, again, air quotes, problematic nature, and emerges on the other side of that as an interesting movie because of those choices. But I think that that's a lot to ask for an audience to stick with a movie that looks like it's mishandling sensitive material until you realize there's that it's not that kind of film. And I'm fascinated by it. It seems in its own way. I mean, this is not the same as like a rape revenge movie, but it definitely seems like there's an element of that. Like we're going to be transgressive or regressive. Sorry, we're going to be regressive before we're transgressive. You have to stick with us for a little while before we set you up for something that's very, very different. It kind of surprisingly feels right in line with a lot of the types of films that you've talked about on the podcast, Vanna.
Yeah, it's something that, like I said, it's hard to digest. I think once you kind of start to understand how you feel about characters, it the next scene it changes that. And then once you kind of get on board with where that scene just took you, then it goes somewhere else. And so the typical viewer is going to like have a hard time being able to like take that ride. I can see where like someone like me who's always watching weird psychosexual stuff and is like begging for something to like push the limit would sit there and be like, yeah, okay, but the average person scrolling through some horror movies on Shudder might be like, what did I just watch? Yeah, it's fun. It feels, I don't want to say because this term sounds not exactly right, but it feels a little like, I don't want to say ahead of its time, but I think especially with where a lot of discourse, like I mentioned, with like morality is
Mhm.
at right now, it would be really interesting to, you know, maybe have some of those people put their money where their mouth is and like come watch Spoonful of Sugar and see how they feel about it. Because, yeah, I don't know. It just, I feel like, especially with that conversation, something like this has just flown under the radar. And I want to be like, look, someone
Yeah.
is, pushing those limits and but you guys just aren't talking about it.
Well, let me ask, Vanna, when you're talking about like, because a lot of the stuff that's in the movie also feeds off of the performances. And in the early going, Morgan Saylor is out on a limb. She is giving a weird, almost campy performance that feels completely out of sync with the rest of the film until the other performances kind of catch up with her. So, what is it about the performances of the actors that helps create? Again, tone is a catch-all word, but what is it about the performances of the actors that helps establish the tone, especially in the last third, that lets you know that everybody in the film is in on the joke as opposed to, fighting against what the movie's trying to do?
I don't know. Yeah, I feel like at the beginning, what's her name? Millicent, she feels like almost in the wrong movie in a way. Like when you look at her, you're like, what is this girl doing? And um everything she says and does at first, I feel like I was almost like, if I were in the situation, I feel like I would be calling whatever bullshit she's feeding me. Like if I was a mom actually looking for a babysitter, I'd be like, girl, like be for real right now.
Yeah.
Um and same thing, like, I mean, obviously there is a history that we don't know about at first, with the father, but you know, at the first time this little pigtailed girl is like standing behind me, like breathing heavy, I'd be like, dude, this babysitter's weird. Like, like, no. So I feel like there's just like this element where she is so out of place and kind of alien, and she's obviously a little off. And so one, I don't know, like the way the parents kind of play their characters, and you're just like, you're trying to figure them out because like I said, there's like this history that you don't fully understand. I think once the kind of like battle for the child happens, like once the mother figures kind of start ramping up a little bit, I think that's when it starts to get a little clear that everyone's a little off. But I don't know. That's a good question. Like I said, I'm still kind of digesting that second watch. But yeah.
Well, yeah, because she's presenting. So the babysitter, Millicent, is presenting as like bookish and nerdy, and the mom makes a joke like, "Oh, she's obviously a virgin," and all these things, and because she does seem unfit for this movie in a strange way, it is hard to get into immediately because you're like, why does this feel so askew? Why does this feel a little strange right now? And I think that's one of the reasons I do like the movie, and especially on a second watch, because as the secrets start surfacing and as the story starts telling itself, you're like, well, yeah, of course, she's the perfect target for this family. Like, she has no one else. She has no one that cares about her outside. Like, you see the insidiousness on all sides of the coin. Like, you see it from Millicent's side, where we find out what she's trying to do. You see it from the family side of all the shit they were hiding and how that comes out later. And it comes together in a way that is like, oh yeah, this is like a pretty fucking evil movie. It doesn't present itself as that way. And then as it slowly unravels, you really get where everyone is coming from. And you're like, oh shit, like we said it before, everyone sucks. Like, everyone sucks in this movie, and they're supposed to. That's the point of
Yeah.
it. But yeah, I also think too, I think there was a lot of chatter around like Baby Girl this year, and it was a movie that didn't really work for me. And it was being called like an erotic thriller, and I was like, no, it's not. Like, literally, it's toothless. It is not doing anything that I would describe as an erotic thriller. And then you see something like Spoonful of Sugar, and while it does have too much going on to be explicitly an erotic thriller, that subline is still there. And I think like a movie like this doing the erotic thriller sensation of it all is so much better than what I think we get on the norm. Let's say with like a Baby Girl that just it never goes as hard as it should or anything like that. Like, it feels prudish in comparison.
Yeah, we have this like it's almost like the opposite of a Black Widow situation. Like she's trying to because she's attracted to the father, like try to replace, and I think that's a really interesting and weird weird thing to do. I don't know. It was like weird because it's like it's mixing like this weird motherly instinct with it's very Freudian, with this like obsession with the father, and so trying to take the place of them. It's like it's actually like a gender swapped Freud thing where we have the, like typically it's you would want to take the place of the father figure. So it's really interesting that it's like a weird gender swap thing. I feel like I have to go watch it again.
And I love the psychological level of it's not as simple as I just want to fuck the dad. Like that's not it. That's a perk of it. Don't get me wrong. That's part of it, but it has more to do with I want to save this child from an evil mother. And like she does, she wants to take over the family. She doesn't. It's not a simple lust. It's not one thing we can point at. Like there's just so much going on, and I think that's again like that's why I keep going back to finding this movie so interesting because it is never just one singular element that is driving someone or one singular motivation. It is, well, yeah, like obviously I want to fuck the father, he's hot, but also I want to save this child from the evil mother who is keeping him locked away. And I can do it with my LSD when no one's looking. And it's like, the fuck is.
It's a wild ride.
It also, I mean, as a household that loves 30 Rock, having Twofer as the psychiatrist is it's a very strange journey to go on when you're seeing, a beloved nerd character. It's so strange.
Harvard, just that's it, like Amelia was just like Harvard. Yep. I'm like, yeah,
yeah, Harvard. It reminds me, which I hadn't thought of in real time, but as y'all are talking about it now, and especially, I think you're absolutely right, Vannah. I think it has like the most surface level Freudian reading, which is fun. I wish more movies would take surface level readings of Freud. In that regard, it kind of feels like a Giallo in the sense that it is playing with incredibly basic psychosexual politics, these family dynamics, and like the repressed psychosexual killers. So to go all the way back to kind of the lens through which you can view it, I think if I had had this presented to me as more like a 70s Italian slasher, as like an Italian giallo, I think that is a lens through horror fans would kind of understand where it's going and where it ends up. And I think that's fun. Like it feels strange to describe it as a fun movie, but like it ends, I think, in a really fun place.
Yeah, I think some of the lighting when it comes to those psychedelic little moments, I think that also adds to there's like a little visual flavor here too. It's
Mm-hmm.
those little moments, like I love stuff like that in my films. A lot of people like I think of like when I watch stuff with my boyfriend who is totally not like well versed in all things genre. So whenever we do watch something that is a little weird and he goes, "What was that? Why did that just happen?" And so but I live for those little moments. That was actually something one other reason I was really excited for Bone Lake and actually for Saw X, the cinematographer that worked on this film, works with Mercedes Bryce Morgan on Bone Lake, and he did the cinematography for Saw X. So I remember after I watched this the first time, I was getting ready to interview them for Saw X, and I was just thinking about I was like the greens and the reds are coming back to the Saw movies, and
Yeah.
yeah, I just but also again like those little pops of color call back to Giallo films that get to have a lot of fun with their visuals and get to have fun with visuals in a way that doesn't have to be explained. Like there's no reason that the blood has to be literal red paint, or there's no reason that it has to be lit this way other than it looks cool. And I appreciate filmmakers that don't shy away from being like, yeah, I that just looks cool.
Yeah. And I think that brings me to the last question we always ask on the podcast, which is talking about how the movie finds its audience going forward. this is still relatively new, certainly by our standards. A lot of the movies that we deal with tend to be kind of in like the dead era of modern film criticism, where there weren't a lot of publications that had sort of sprouted up and were, going through and getting Rotten Tomatoes certified. 2022, lots of horror publications, are registered with Certified Forgotten. Lots of indie publications are getting the reviews out there, and yet this still is right at about that like 10 movie review limit. So what kind of a future do you think Spoonful of Sugar has for horror fans who maybe are into the weird shit, maybe into the psychosexual stuff? How does this movie find its audience with time?
I feel like I don't know. I feel like as we continue to get this we get these little pockets of moral panic and discussion. It's like always an ebb and flow of talking about morality and sex on screen. And I feel like each time that conversation is brought up, there's a filmmaker ready to combat that and give you exactly what people are crying out against. And so I feel like as more of those conversations keep happening, I do feel like, something like her work, not just Spoonful of Sugar, but also Bone Lake will kind of get brought up in conversation. I'm hoping Bone Lake eventually gets some distribution and um because that one is a little more outwardly fun, in a more, like, traditional sense. It's, like, funny, I feel like maybe that one's a little easier to digest and will allow people to come back to Spoonful of Sugar, like, a lot of the times, when I find movies that I really love and I find out it's, like, a director's, like, 2nd or 3rd movie, I, like, always wanna go back to their first their
Mhm.
debut and kind of trace, the evolution of their filmmaking, so I'm hoping that would happen, yeah, I don't know, I feel like every year also we get these, like, it's gonna be Valentine's Day, we get these lists, I feel like erotic thriller kind of films, kind of like anti-Valentine's Day lists always get brought up. So I feel like, just maybe as, we continue to approach more Valentine's Days coming up, maybe this will get brought up. Maybe I'll have to write something.
Yes, I think you definitely should. Donato, are you going to eventually own the TerraVision release of Spoonful of Sugar?
No, Shudder's actually very good at releasing Blu-rays. I believe this is on Blu-ray already. So I mean, I was gonna bring that up though. It's a Shudder release, so you are stuck to you not stuck. Obviously, we are very pro Shudder here, but you have to have a Shudder subscription to watch it, and that is a great thing because it gives it a platform. It puts it with a bunch of other movies you can find very easily, but it also does let it fall through the cracks in the way that I'm always surprised when like a Shudder movie has the number of reviews that fit our criteria, because I always think like horror fans are watching Shudder pretty well, and we know what's going there. We know what pops up, especially an original. So when I see something like Spoonful of Sugar really fall through the cracks, it becomes a thing of what Vanna just said. Like, write about it if you're a critic and you want people to watch it. You have to put it on lists. You have to get the conversation going. Curiosity on the part of the audience where they're scrolling through, and I feel like Spoonful of Sugar, the title and the poster, doesn't really completely convey what's going on. So if you are just scrolling through, you have to take a gamble on it. Take that gamble. Sure, it doesn't have Jason on the front or a slasher or something. Do it, but it's also harder. So the boutique release, sure, of course, that'll help. But I feel like something like Spoonful of Sugar is going to do better when Bone Lake gets its release, when it comes out later, and as she continues to make more movies. This is going to be that movie you go back and go, okay, well, you've seen the fourth and third now. Have you seen Bone Lake? Have you seen Spoonful of Sugar? Like, she's only going to gain momentum, I hope, at least, because I think her style is immaculate. So I just want to see more from her. And as she gains popularity, people actually are, good enough to go back and put the catalog to rest for them, because that's I feel like that's the only way to do this, with a Shudder title. Again, great service, we love it, but it only has a certain amount of viewers, and if you don't have Shudder, you can't see it. So that
Mhm.
for me is where it comes in.
And it's worth noting that this movie has one of the more unhinged log lines you'll ever read. If you're just scrolling through Shudder and you're looking at the one sentence descriptions of movies, this will stop you. This is something that you'll pause and be like, how is how is that profitable for Frito-Lay? Like how does this all come together in a singular movie? So never rule out people that are just digging through log lines and being like, this is my Friday night film. That's it. That is our podcast on Spoonful of Sugar. And we are very, very grateful to Vannah Taylor for bringing us this and having a really fun conversation, exactly like you talked about with your Ariel stuff, like a movie that I went in feeling one way and had an enlightened conversation. I'm glad I didn't log it on Letterboxd yet because my score probably would have been lower than it is now. But for those that do want to see more of the film criticism that you're writing, that want more insights into the kind of anti-Valentine's Day material that you're about to write in celebration of the holiday, where's the best place for folks to connect with you online? Is there good social media that they can follow you on?
Yeah, so I am at Siren Death Cult on all of the social medias. I'm trying to use Blue Sky more. So yeah, their Instagram, that's my handle on Letterboxd, on everything. So I'm pretty active everywhere. I try to be. I also have my own website called sirendeathcult.com. So I try to repost everything that I write for other outlets on there as well and kind of keep everything in one place. Yeah, and then my writing's pretty regularly now on Offscreen Central, sometimes Moviejawn, places like that, and maybe an upcoming issue of Fango.
Mm. We love our Fango articles here at Certified Forgotten, and I'm going to use that as a kick over to Donato too, because you wrote something that I can't read yet because I haven't seen the monkey, but you wrote something I'm bookmarking and very excited to read in the future. So, where do folks go to see that and other kill related content that you might be working on?
Yeah, you can follow me as always at Donatobomb, DonatoBomb. And that's going to be Blue Sky. It's going to be Instagram. And that's going to be Letterboxd for the most right now. You can follow me other places except Twitter. That shit's dead. I ain't going back there. Fuck him. So
Mm-hmm.
follow my work. It is on so many places. I will tweet it out. I will put it in the right place. I just said tweet. God damn it. It's
I say no.
post
I
it.
say tweet all the time
Okay,
when I'm referring to Blue Sky. I just like I'm not letting that word die with Twitter.
good.
I tweet from Blue Sky. That's what I do.
Good, because I ain't skeeting either. That's
It's
that
like it's like
we're not
Kleenex.
doing
It
that.
is no. It's a phrase that has come to mean a post. It doesn't mean specific to a platform. I think
He renamed it from Twitter, so technically
it's out there for
his
the taking.
platform shouldn't be able to claim tweet anyways.
Bingo. Feel like I've gotten off course here. Anyway, I just wrote a bunch of Sundance reviews. You can read those. I'm gearing up for South by. I'm going to have a very busy South by in about 3 weeks. So keep your eyes peeled. I've always got stuff coming. I might, I got an article on IGN coming up. I got an article over here, over there. I'm fucking tired.
Yeah, I don't write that much anymore, but you can still find me on Blue Sky, monocle.bsky.social. You can follow Certified Forgotten, visit our website, certifiedforgotten.com. Follow us on Instagram and on Blue Sky. Subscribe to our podcast on anything from YouTube or Spotify to your podcast platform of choice. And we'll continue to bring you the kind of movies you're not going to talk about anywhere else. You got another podcast in mind that's talking about something like Spoonful of Sugar? I fucking doubt it. That's what you get here. It's what you get from awesome guests like Vannah Taylor. So, Vannah, thank you for coming on the show. It was great to have you here today.
Yeah, thank you. This was so fun.
All right, Donato, real quick before you do your walkout thing, I want to give a special shout out to Rogers the dog, who did not bark once on this episode of the podcast. I know I might have just jinxed myself, but got a sleepy boy in the background on camera. So, Rogers, thank you so much for facilitating a smooth edit for your dad here. I think he appreciates that. Donato, take us home.
Dad.